Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura, and thank you to Nature Vancouver for hosting me. I always love presenting in front of you folks. You are incredible, and you've really made a difference on Caribou, and I'm going to talk about that tonight. My name is Tim Burkhart. I am the Peace Region and Strategic Engagement Program Manager. It's a crazy long title for the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. I'm calling in today from the traditional territory of the Sanish, Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanic peoples and the Lekwungen speaking peoples here in Victoria, BC. I do want to give thanks to those nations and their elders past, present, and future for allowing me to be a guest on their territory. And I've worked up in the Peace Country before I moved to Victoria in 2018 for 5 years, living in the town of Chetwynd in the Peace Country. An absolutely extraordinary place to live. The background behind me is from mountains up there, and I'm going to tell a story a little bit about that region, about caribou, about the work of Indigenous-led conservation, and good news for a change. It's a rare thing, and so usually in these presentations we're talking about a lot of doom and gloom, and I mean there's a little bit of that, but in the broad sense, there's been some really good action for caribou this year, and I really want to celebrate it. So yeah, we'll dive right in. Caribou are an incredible species. The first time I saw them was up in the Peace Country in the Muskwakachika. Some of you have heard this story when I told it in January, but just how curious, intelligent, and almost magical they are as an animal, and how important they are to ecosystems across all of their ranges. And we look at caribou as an indicator species, that the health of caribou herds can indicate the health of a landscape, the health of the ecology. So I usually like to start presentations with a story, and there's one that's really fitting here. So Laura mentioned my doggy Mick. He might jump on my lap throughout this presentation. He doesn't like when I'm talking to anybody but him, so he might interrupt. But this is him and me as we hiked up into the subalpine and alpine, about 50 kilometers west of Chetwynd with two friends in the summer. This is August in the north of, it was 2018, I believe I was up here. Now this territory is, we drove up a coal mining road called, into what's known as the First Coal Lands. This is an area of the northern Wild Heart Mountains, again, just between Prince George-ish, a little bit north, and the town of Chetwynd. And was the home of the burnt pine caribou herd. Unfortunately, the burnt pine caribou herd was extirpated, locally extinct, in 2013. They were the catalyst for a lawsuit by West Moberly First Nations against the British Columbia government that ensured and enshrined the right of Treaty 8 First Nations to not only harvest caribou, but the right to have caribou on the landscape and the obligations of governments to ensure that there's adequate habitat. It's a landmark case, an incredibly important case that really starts where this story happens. As we were hiking in the mountains, came across a really beautiful number of alpine tarns and lakes, and decided to have lunch at this one. And right across the lake, I spied something sort of white and shiny in and amongst the gravel and shale and wildflowers, and thought it was something interesting. So we hiked down with the dogs and scrambled over the lake and came across an antler lying in amongst the wildflowers of the alpine. Some of you have held this antler. I brought it to my presentation in January. I don't like to take things from the backcountry. I'm a pack in, pack out kind of camper. But something about this antler called to me. It told me it has a story to tell. I knew this was an antler shed from the burnt pine herd. I knew that the animal that had carried this antler was long gone, and that its entire lineage had been erased by the actions of industry, coal mining, and other cumulative impacts of human development. And I knew that it had a story to tell to audiences across the country about how mountain caribou are struggling for survival, about what people can do to stand up for caribou, and how people in Indigenous communities, in local communities, and conservation organizations just like Nature Vancouver are working hard to recover iconic species, endangered species, like caribou and many others. So I brought this antler with me across the province as I gave presentations like I'm doing today. I brought it. It's been in cabinet offices in Ottawa and Victoria. It's something tangible, something you can feel. You can feel the weight of it. You can see where little animals have nibbled on it. You can see how it's still giving life to the landscape even after the animal is dead. And I feel like that gives audiences a connection to place. As this antler has told its story, it finally culminated in helping to tell the story at the signing of a historic agreement to recover caribou in the North Peace, including in the area where it was found, and protect more than 2 million acres of land for caribou habitat. So in closing the loop, I'll be joining Chief Roland Wilson's pictured here, along with Parliamentary Secretary for Forest and Lands, Ravi Kahlon, in returning the antler to the Burnt Pine range. And I have the GPS coordinates where I took it this summer. Hopefully, we'll see with the pandemic and all, but it has told its story and it has been successful, and it is good news for a change. But before I get into what that good news is, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, and the work that we do. Our vision is an interconnected system of wild lands and waters stretching from the Yellowstone National Park in the United States all the way to the Yukon, the Greater Mackenzie Mountains, that harmonizes the needs of people with those of nature. It's about working together to ensure that there is a place for both communities and human people, as well as wildlife and abundant natural beauty and intact nature. And when I think back to why we started working this way, it's really because the animals told us to. It's a bear that moved from the Yukon into central BC, a wolf named Pluie who moved between 2 provinces, 2 states, 2 countries, a fish, a lynx, more caribou. All of these animals are making these extraordinary journeys in search of new homes and new mates. And they're telling us to think big, to think beyond these little protected areas, beyond our borders, the connections between them. And what makes Y2Y unique is that we work at that scale, and we work at that scale temporally as well. We have a 100-year vision looking a century ahead while tackling the most important problems of the day. We recognize, as Pluie the wolf did, that boundaries aren't that important to wildlife. And so we work across boundaries. We work with partners in the United States and in Alberta, in the Northwest Territories, the Yukon and BC, to ensure that connectivity includes across borders. We also recognize we can't do what we want to do alone. We need to support local conservation projects and partner with more than 300 organizations across the Y2Y region, because we know we can do a lot more together than we could alone. And finally, we ensure that all of our work is rooted in sound science and a foundation of science, and we work with communities, with First Nations, with governments, with anyone who wants to get to solutions on the ground, and we work in that collaborative approach. We have to, because the Y2Y region is enormous, 1.3 million square kilometers, twice the size of Alberta, a wide diversity of ecosystems from the prairie in the south, all the way up to the muskeg and the tundra in the northern part of the realm. Y2Y has also been called the mother of rivers, in that it's the source of drinking water for more than 15 million people across Western North America. The Fraser, the Columbia, the Peace, the Bow, all these rivers rise in the Y2Y region and provide clean drinking water and for cities like Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton. And again, the animals are telling us to look at this landscape. While the map on the left shows the historic range, and the more hotter the colors, the more big fuzzy animals like carnivores, ungulates, mammals existed 200 years ago, what their range was. Grizzly bears used to range as far as eastern Ontario and Manitoba. Today, they're confined within the Rocky Mountain Trench, although they are recolonizing parts of Alberta and Montana, which is very exciting. But as we see on the right map here, all the animals, all of the large ungulates and carnivores that were here 200 years ago are still here in the Y2Y region, and we work really hard to keep it that way. It's a refugia for wildlife as climate change pushes wildlife north and up into mountains. It's going to continue to be a refugia as the landscape changes continuously across Western North America. And all of this is in the context of a massive global biodiversity crisis. We share this Earth with an estimated 5 to 30 million other species, and according to the United Nations, more than 1 million of those species are threatened with extinction currently. Nature is declining at rates unprecedented in human history, and these extinctions are accelerating. Transformative changes are needed to restore and protect nature. This is a global assessment approved unanimously by 132 member countries in 2019. Another way to look at this is the Living Planet Index, as we see a decline in the population sizes of more than 3,000 species of vertebrates by more than 50% since 1970, 58% by 2012. And in the context of this, we have British Columbia, which has the most biodiversity of any jurisdiction in North America, any province or territory in Canada, any state in the United States, as well as the most species at risk of extinction. 278 species in BC are at risk of extinction, 1,807 others in decline. And we do not have Endangered Species Act in BC. One of the few provinces that does not. And this was a promise of the BC NDP government when they were running for office, and when it is in the mandate letter of the Minister of Environment. They have not done this, and by all accounts, they have abandoned this promise for now. Caribou are a really good example of this crisis. Across Canada, caribou are in decline, whether they are the barren ground caribou, and a lot of people, when they think of caribou, they're thinking of those huge herds in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, and even, or the boreal caribou across the boreal forest. But we also have caribou in British Columbia, quite a few, if you see here, including the southern mountain caribou, the sort of pinkish color along the southern Rocky Mountains. Caribou's historic range and threatened range really do show just how much there is a crisis. You can see here, and I know we have some from Idaho, these South Selkirk herds just at the bottom there. One of the last herds to walk between British Columbia, between Canada and the United States, between BC and Idaho, who were functionally declared extirpated in 2016. I'm very, very hopeful that's not accurate and that there are animals remaining, but that remains to be seen. But regardless, the last remaining caribou overlap with the ancient inland temperate rainforest, one of the only ones on the planet, which is at risk from old growth logging. Caribou are an incredible animal. As I said, an indicator species. We can look at the health of landscapes by looking at caribou. And what makes the southern mountain caribou so distinct is their behavior. Whereas those barren ground caribou defend themselves by being in huge herds and having lots and lots of babies, mountain caribou are a different beast. They feed on arboreal lichen. They look for deep snow and dense forests in which they can hide and avoid predators. And that's a really key difference between them and other ungulate species that they encounter, like deer and elk and moose, who either have very heightened flight responses where they run away, and very, very defensive techniques like moose, where they're willing to stand up to predators. Caribou just try and stay away from them and avoid them altogether. So as we change the landscape, and this is a great infographic from the BC government, whether it's through fires, through climate change and fires, through logging, through oil and gas exploration, wherever we're making a change on the landscape, it's almost inevitably going to be bad for caribou. So these new forests, whether it's been burned or cut, provide new forage for species like elk and deer and moose, which in turn drives up the wolf population. At the same time, you've got all these new roads and seismic lines and pipelines creating travel corridors for wolves and increasing their hunting efficiency. They just encounter caribou more, and they're a lot easier to kill. So we're in a situation now where there are huge herds of elk in the Peace. And I've been stopped by a herd of elk that was more than 100 animals crossing the road. It's incredible, but I've also talked to West Moberly First Nations elders who remember very few elk. They weren't a staple diet food. We remember no cougar until recently. And what's happening is, as those prey species fill in behind the caribou are the ones who are suffering. Across BC, there are a number of different designatable units, or DUs, of caribou, whether it's the northern boreal, the central or southern groups. All of them are threatened. I disagree with these listings under SARA, and we're currently working to press the federal government to list southern mountain caribou as endangered, which would line up with BC's listing of them. Essentially, all of these animals are in trouble. All of these animals are in trouble and in steep decline from even the 1990s. In the early 2000s, there were more than 800 caribou in the orange areas of the Peace region. Now there's about 219, 220, we're not sure. In the southern group, 2,500 animals in the mid-1990s, down to around 1,000 today. This chart is out of date. Caribou are in trouble, it's an emergency, and we need to pull all the levers of recovery. And some of you have seen this before, so I hope it's not too repetitive, but I really think this is important. I see BC's approach to caribou recovery as the Sarah Palin policy. Sarah Palin, the former governor of Alaska and vice presidential candidate, when asked about caribou, said, if a caribou needs to be sacrificed for the sake of energy, then Mr. Caribou, you need to take one for the team. And this has been the approach of successive governments in British Columbia for species at risk in general, and the caribou are taking it for the team. This is the last of the burnt pine herd, whose antler I found. This is a bull who fell into a tailings pond at First Gold Corporation's lands. Lands that they had not yet been permitted to explore and were retroactively issued those permits and then lost the court case. But anyway, very, very sad situation. And I'm hoping that one day we'll have way more caribou in the Peace Country and across BC, enough to support sustainable, self-sustaining populations, to support Indigenous harvests for social, cultural, and economic reasons, and to support the ecosystems that depend on caribou as well. Historically, the elders of West Moberly and Soto remember a sea of caribou like bugs on the land, and that is a constant whether you speak to elders of Treaty 8 nations in the Peace or in the Kootenays with the Tanaha and Okanagan Nation Alliance and Okanagan Indian Band and the Sinaiks and Splatsin. Caribou existed in large numbers in huge herds, so much that we named a huge part of central BC the Caribou. There's very few caribou left in the Caribou. In 1995, there were 2,500 southern mountain caribou, that is south of Chetwynd in BC, currently about 1,000, an average decline of 10% a year. That's not a sign of an animal that is going to be on the landscape for very long. But people across British Columbia, across caribou ranges, are working really hard to recover them. This is some aerial footage from the Clinsazaa maternal pen, showing 5 mothers with their calves leading them into safety from our scary drone, which they didn't like and we'd never used again. But this is an example of the extent that and the incredible lengths and courage that Indigenous communities, that First Nations leaders, that local communities, conservation groups, biologists have been working to recover these animals. Each one of those little teeny tiny calves represents about a $250,000 investment to recover them to full health. And it has been working. The Clinsazaa recovery is miraculous. I do not know of a more successful wild caribou recovery program on the planet. We can see here all the different herds from the Peace. I mentioned the burnt pine. You can see they did not survive. The Clinsazaa herd saw this huge drop from the early 2000s to 16 animals in 2014. They've moved that to 61 by 2017, and this year we're pretty sure they hit 100. This has been an extraordinary journey and extremely expensive, extremely heartbreaking, extremely hard work, but really very important, and really shows that the leadership of West Moberly and Soto is what is recovering these animals. You can see the Quintet herd, the Narrowway herd have not had the same attention as the Clinsazaa herd, and they are declining as well. So what is it that they're doing right? For conservationists and scientists I've spoken to, for traditional knowledge holders, it's that they're pulling all the levers of caribou recovery. We know we can't just rely on killing wolves. We know we can't just rely on protecting habitat. And we have to look at where is their habitat that's degraded and needs to be restored. We need to pull all the levers of recovery. That's exactly what West Moberly has been doing. They've made their maternal pen They've run 2 businesses to both plant and grow native plants for restoration projects and then go and do the work. They've done habitat mapping and protection. They've had a moratorium on caribou hunting since the 1970s. They've been working on ground predator management as a short-term Band-Aid solution to protect these animals while they recover, and it's working. The Central Group's habitat here in Chetwynd, in the Peace Country, you can see the sort of light blue is high elevation habitat they really, really like. The sort of orange color is very high quality, low elevation. All of this habitat matters, including the gray between them, the matrix habitat that represents that connectivity between high value places where there's good place for calving, for these animals to have their babies, for food, for sustenance during the winter and summer months. It's very, very important. Unfortunately, a lot of the matrix habitat especially is where we see intensive logging and destruction of habitat, coal mining, oil and gas activity, wind farming, you name it, every type of industry is impacting caribou in the Peace Country. And this is what that looks like. I've shown these maps before, I think, but the map on the left, the hotter the color, the closer the area is to human-caused disturbance. If it is red, that's less than 500 meters. On the map on the right is the percentage of intact forest per watershed unit. There's not a lot left up there, but there is this intact corridor through the Wildheart Mountains up into the Musqueam. Really, really critical area that needs to be protected to recover caribou and 37 other red and blue listed species in BC that include grizzly bears, fisher, wolverine, a number of very interesting plants and butterflies that, and including stuff that I'm sure Ron Long could talk to you about a bit more than me. But there still is this intact area left, and that overlaps with much of the remaining caribou habitat. So what has happened? I thought I'd give a little overview of the timeline, just to get a sense of how long it takes to get from we know there's a problem to how do we find a solution. In 1972, Saulteaux and West Moberly banned hunting. 40 years later, the burnt pine herd was extirpated, which created a court case that affirmed Treaty 8 Nations' right to the existence of caribou on the landscape. In 2014, Saulteaux and West Moberly initiated their maternal pen to recover the 16 animals remaining in the Moberly Clinsazah. 2 years later, the Quintet herd saw a huge decline after BC expanded a new coal mine, despite the fact that the environmental assessment said it would have a huge effect on caribou and Indigenous rights. In 2017, the two nations constructed a second maternal pen and completed an $80,000 logging road restoration project. The Moberly herd reached 60 animals. In March, BC and Canada came together with West Moberly and Saulteaux to conclude a draft partnership agreement with key conservation measures based on scientific and traditional knowledge. That was 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago. The next month, BC walked away from the table. That summer, the federal government determined there was an imminent threat to caribou recovery, making BC liable for action under the Species at Risk Act, which could see the federal government seize provincial land for conservation. This scared BC. To get them back to the table, the chiefs met with the federal and provincial ministers, and BC decided to re-engage for now. By the fall, they'd concluded the text of a second partnership agreement, but by winter, BC had walked away again. In January, the chiefs managed to force a meeting with the government, who finally committed to initialing the agreement by February 1st. It was initialed, I believe, on February 21st, so a little bit later, and or early March, and they went to public engagement. That started with the idea of signing that agreement in June. March to June saw a torrent of misinformation, conspiracy theories, bullying, and generally ugly behavior at public town hall meetings. BC responded by extending the engagement and appointing a leaders table to try and work through some of the misinformation and address the racism, which was subject to a resolution by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs to request a public inquiry into what had happened with the racist abuse West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations members had experienced for trying to recover caribou in their traditional territory. By August, While that leaders table was continuing to deliberate, West Moberly and Soto had continued to work on recovering the animals, and the Moberly Clinsza herd reached about 9 plus. Finally, by February 21st, 2020, about a month after I presented to Nature Vancouver, they signed the agreement together at a historic ceremony in Vancouver, where we have Minister of Energy Mines Bruce Ralston, Chief Ken Cameron, Minister of Forests and Lands Doug Donaldson, the Federal Minister of Environment Jonathan Wilkinson, the Provincial Minister of Environment George Heyman, and Chief Roland Wilson of West Moberly First Nations. This was a really historic day, protecting 2 million acres of caribou habitat in the piece, providing for recovery options across that territory. So if we look at this map, this is that green part. This is the Wild Hearts. This is that corridor. And it includes a new protected area, an indigenous protected area of about 200,000 hectares to protect the Clinsza herd. This is the first new expansion of the protected areas network in the Northeast in 20 years. An additional 550,000 hectares interim protections, which will be examined again every 10 years by the committees. And finally, this committee representing West Moberly, Soto, Canada, and BC will review all new projects that might impact caribou with an eye towards caribou first and a request for consensus. It's not perfect. It has weaker protections for the quintet and the narrowway herds. It lacks some low elevation and matrix habitat protections, but it is hard to overstate how important this is. This is the biggest expansion of protected areas in BC since the Great Bear Rainforest, and it is entirely been Indigenous led. And I want to say, being at the ceremony, a very emotional day, I heard from both Chief Wilson, Chief Cameron, and their lead lawyers just how important voices like yours were. When I came and presented to you on January 21st, I asked if you would write a letter, if your members would write letters to the Premier, asking him to finally sign this agreement. And I believe I got 31 letters, which is extraordinary. And I sent them all to the Premier. I got a note back from his chief of staff, his administrator, saying the Premier had seen them and thanked us for sending them. I have been told by the nations that they could not have done this without the support of people like you in the audience today. And I really believe that. I think that's really important. These politicians will not take this action unless they know their constituents care. And you stood up for caribou. You stood up for caribou when the nations were standing. You stood with them, and we got the job done. It was signed. It's going to happen. It's real, and we can do this. It's incredible that this happened. That leaves caribou across the rest of BC still without that level of protection. So there's still work we've got to do. It never ends. As I said to the minister when the agreement was signed, I'd be sending thank you letters, but it'd be thank you and this is the and part. All of these two maps, the one on the left shows the different caribou herds in the province. If it's red, it's extirpated, like the pine up near Chetwynd. If it's purpley colored, it's that southern mountain group. The map on the right is from my friends at the Wilderness Committee, a great organization. Fully support them, check them out for sure. They do great work on old growth and do some amazing research on logging, which is what this map shows, which is logging permits in critical caribou habitat since it was designated critical caribou habitat. So these are the permits being issued to companies to log old growth and in critical caribou habitat, and we know it's critical caribou habitat that should be protected, that under the Species at Risk Act and the recovery strategy should not be logged. And yet we've seen, I think it was 800 since 2012. So as always, we're facing a choice in British Columbia, whether we want to have caribou on the landscape going forward, whether or not our kids and grandkids will get to experience caribou. They're an incredible species. I think that what this has shown is that this type of conservation, this type of Indigenous-led action is effective, it works. It's the real deal, but it doesn't work unless people in key constituencies are writing to their leaders, writing to their decision makers, making noise about it, saying, we're watching, we care about caribou, we're gonna stand up for caribou, and we're gonna vote about caribou. You need to listen to us, you need to support these kind of initiatives. To complete the loop, this was one of the proudest days of my life, getting to stand with the two chiefs and hold the Antler at the day of the signing ceremony. And again, we'll be all taking it up to the Peace to return it to the land later this summer, hopefully. I hope so. And finally, this is Spencer Owens Breek, brand new baby who belongs to both Saulteaux and West Moberly First Nations. And at the ceremony, Chief Rowland said that this agreement was for him, and that one day he hoped Spencer would get to eat caribou and experience caribou. And I hope that that's the same for all of us. I hope that all of our kids and grandkids get to live in a province, to live in a country that values wildlife, that values our connection to the natural world. And I think we can do that. I really do. I am optimistic. I'm trying to be relentlessly positive in 2020, despite everything, because I know that this is possible. I know that we can do this. And I'm just going to leave with the words of Chief Cameron and Chief Wilson. This is a powerful moment in history, a turning point for BC and Canada and First Nations, people working together to save a species from extinction. It's real. We can do this. Our new partnership agreement confirms it. Join with us, support us, make it happen for the future generations to come. Saulteaux First Nations, their ancestors were given a prophecy by the Creator that they would find sanctuary at the Twin Sisters Mountains called Clinsizat. And they've kept faith to that prophecy and are working to keep it as a sanctuary to endangered caribou as well. And for Chief Roland Wilson, recognizing that for thousands of years since time immemorial, the caribou have given food, clothes, and tools. They're not just animals, they're brothers and sisters, friends and ancestors. They've been suffering for decades as their habitat is destroyed. And they need us all of us. And this partnership agreement gives us hope. It means that help is on the way. And finally, he ends it with a call to the communities of the Peace region to work productively with them to dispel those myths, combat that racism, and promote a region rich in wildlife, culture, and sustainable economic activity. And I don't want to leave on a sour note, but there has been continued struggles with this agreement, continued struggles with these nations. And so I think the most important thing to do, I was struggling on what my call to action will be for you tonight. And I think I want to ask if you'll send a thank you to Chief Wilson and his community, to Chief Cameron and his community, and if you feel like to BC and Canada as well, for their collaborative work to recover caribou. It has been, I have been told, like a siege in some of these communities. And on Saturday, somebody shot a gun through the window of Saulteaux First Nations Lands Department after an incendiary article was published in the Alaska Highway News. This is some pretty ugly stuff still happening in response to two nations struggling to recover caribou on their traditional territory. And they know they need people like us and people like you to stand with them. So I've made a little tool for you at y2y.net/caribou where you can thank the chiefs. I would suggest you continue to write to your elected representatives, tell them you care about caribou and that this partnership agreement is a good model. The federal minister said this is the template, this is what we want to do elsewhere. The province doesn't want to do it again because it's just too effective. So I'd ask that you consider writing, reaching out to your MLAs and MPs, let them know that this is important to you. And if you have the time to send a letter to West Moberly and Saulteaux thanking them, I know they appreciate it. They really, really do. It helps with morale. So thank you again, all. I will stop sharing my screen and I invite and welcome all your questions and hopefully we can have a little discussion.